In a quiet Georgia town, a 42-year-old female mechanic named Gladys Mercer uncovered more than just rusted metal in her backyard. She unearthed a buried vintage car tied to a forgotten war secret. What started as routine yard work turned into the discovery of a hidden journal, classified documents, and a decades-old betrayal buried beneath the soil. This emotional story of how one woman's curiosity uncovered a forgotten war secret will leave you speechless and remind you that some truths refuse to stay buried. But before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? We love seeing our global family in the comments. Let's get started. Tucked away in the quiet farmland just outside Bowman, Georgia, lived Gladys Mercer, a 42-year-old mechanic with calloused hands and a stubborn heart. She wasn't the type to chase adventure. She preferred things that could be fixed with a wrench and a little grit. Her home, a modest farmhouse with peeling shutters and a chimney that coughed in the winter, had been passed down from her grandfather, a Woist vet who never spoke much about the war or anything beyond the weather and his tomato plants. Gladys lived alone, except for Buddy, her old German shepherd who still barked at squirrels like they were foreign invaders. Her days were predictable: early mornings in the garage fixing up old trucks, evenings with a cup of coffee on the porch, and Sundays spent tending to the overgrown garden behind the shed. She found comfort in the quiet. But lately, that comfort had been disturbed. A soft dip in the ground behind the azalea bush kept catching her eye. It looked like nothing, just time doing what time does. But one morning, as dew clung to her boots and a crow called from the fence post, Gladys picked up her shovel, and her life began to shift. Gladys hadn't planned to dig that day. She'd only gone out to check the garden, maybe prune the roses if she had time. But something about the soft patch of earth by the azalea bush gnawed at her like an itch beneath the skin you couldn't quite scratch. So, without really thinking, she grabbed her grandfather's old shovel from the shed, the handle worn smooth by decades of use, and took her first stab into the ground. The soil gave way too easily. That was the first sign. She dug for hours, pausing only to wipe the sweat from her brow or shoo Buddy away from sniffing too close. With each shovel of dirt, a strange mix of anticipation and dread bloomed in her chest. At first, she thought it might be a buried oil tank, maybe even a septic system nobody told her about. But then the edge of something metallic caught the morning light. Not rusted pipes. Not a tank. A fender. She dropped to her knees, heart thudding in her ears, and brushed away the dirt with her hands. A curved piece of chrome emerged, dulled with age but unmistakably part of a vehicle, and not just any vehicle. The lines were smooth, rounded 1940s or maybe even late 1930s. Definitely military. Gladys had spent her life fixing cars, and if there was one thing she knew well, it was a vintage chassis. This wasn't junk. This was history. She spent the rest of the afternoon unearthing it slowly, carefully, her hands trembling more with each layer revealed. The outline of a vintage army jeep began to form, sunken in the soil like a fossil. Tires flattened, paint flaking, the U.S. Army star barely visible on the side panel. How had no one known this was here? Why had her grandfather never mentioned it? By sundown, the front end and windshield frame were fully exposed. She leaned against the shovel, staring at it in silence. Her back aching and her brain spinning. Buddy whimpered beside her. "You feel it too, huh?" she muttered. She stood there until the light faded from the sky. That night, Gladys couldn't sleep. She sat in her recliner with an untouched cup of coffee. The house still except for the ticking of the wall clock and Buddy snoring by the door. Her mind kept circling back to the Jeep. Not just that it was there, but how it had been so perfectly hidden. The earth above it had compacted naturally, No sign of disturbance. No indication that anything had ever been buried there. She thought about her grandfather, Walter Mercer, a quiet man with deep lines on his face and a voice like gravel. He'd raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 9. Never cruel, but distant. Protective. He'd kept a journal, but never let her read it. Kept a locked trunk in the attic. To another one of those family mysteries she was told not to mess with. Her stomach churned. Had he done this? Had he buried it? And if so, why? The next morning, she woke before sunrise and went back to the garden. The jeep sat in its partial grave, looking even more haunting in the pale morning light. She brought tools this time. Gloves, a crowbar, her socket set. She wanted inside. The driver's side door creaked, then jammed. She managed to wedge it open after some effort, coughing as a puff of dry, moldy air escaped. The interior was in surprisingly decent shape, considering it had been underground for what must have been 60, 70 years. And then she saw it. On the passenger seat, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small metal box rectangular, rusted at the hinges, but still intact. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. The weight of it heavier than it should have been. She hesitated. For a moment, she thought of just walking away, leaving the whole thing for the police, or some historian, or anyone who could handle the weight of whatever this was. But she was a Mercer. Mercers didn't walk away from hard things. She carried the box inside. It took her half an hour to crack it open. Inside, she found a leather-bound journal with the initials H.M. etched faintly on the front. A set of black and white photographs, faded but clear enough to see uniformed men, military bases, and what looked like a remote European village. And tucked beneath the journal a medal, not a standard issue pin. This was something different, something old and rare, French resistance, if she wasn't mistaken. Her breath caught in her throat. The journal was written in neat, blocky handwriting. Not her grandfather's. It told the story of a man named Henry Monroe, an American soldier stationed in France in 1944. The last few entries were disturbing. He spoke of a mission gone wrong, betrayal within his own unit, and a decision to disappear to hide both the vehicle and the documents he believed would expose something larger. Something he never wanted found. And somehow, it had ended up buried in Gladys Mercer's backyard. She closed the journal, heart racing. This wasn't just a relic. This was a secret. A wartime secret someone had wanted to bury forever. And now it was in her hands. Gladys sat at the kitchen table, the metal box open before her like a confession. The faded journal lay in her lap. The final entry burned into her mind. They won't find me. Not here. If anyone ever does, I hope they understand why I couldn't let it surface. Some truths are too heavy to carry. So I buried mine. H. She ran her fingers over the embossed initials again. Where's H.M.? Not Walter Mercer. Not anyone she knew. Then why had the Jeep, the journal, and this story been buried on her grandfather's land? It made no sense. Unless... She pushed back her chair and rushed up the attic stairs 2 steps at a time. The locked trunk. The one her grandfather had warned her not to touch. Some things are better left in the dark, he'd once told her, his voice tight. Gladys broke the lock with a crowbar. Inside were old uniforms, photographs, and a letter tucked inside a Bible. It was addressed to Walter Mercer, but signed by Henry Monroe. Walt, I know you'll keep it safe. Don't tell anyone, not even family. If they come looking, you were never part of this. I'll take the blame. You just bury it. Literally. H. Gladys sat back, stunned. Her grandfather had been protecting someone, a fellow soldier, a friend, or maybe something deeper. That afternoon, she returned to the Jeep, brushing off leaves and soil, staring at the faded army star on the door. The silence around her was heavy. Too heavy. Buddy growled. She turned. A man stood at the edge of her property, tall, mid-50s, wearing a ball cap and sunglasses. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. Just stood there, still as a statue, hands in his pockets. "Can I help you?" Gladys called out, stepping protectively in front of the Jeep. The man took one step forward, then another, slow and deliberate. "Just admiring the view," he said, voice even but cold. "Heard someone was digging out here." Gladys narrowed her eyes. "You from around here?" He didn't answer, just tilted his head slightly, like he was sizing her up. "I think you've seen enough," she said firmly. The man smirked, then turned and walked away without another word. By the time she reached the road, he was gone. No car, no footprints, just gone. That night, she couldn't sleep. Again. But it wasn't the journal, or the photos, or even the car that haunted her. It was that man, the way he stood, the way he spoke, the look in his eyes that said, "You've found something you shouldn't have." She sat on the edge of her bed with the journal in her hands. There were coordinates scribbled in the back, beneath the final entry. French coordinates, latitude and longitude. Her hands trembled. Had Henry Monroe buried more than a Jeep? She flipped through the photos again. One caught her eye, a photo of a man standing in front of a building with an eagle emblem on it, and above it, Operation Sentinel. She'd never heard of it. She took a photo of it with her phone, then hesitated before searching. The results were sparse, mostly dead links, broken archives, redacted files. One caught her attention. Operation Sentinel, declassified records pending appeal, U.S. Archives 1944, 1963. Gladys blinked. The war was over by then. So what had carried on that long? The next day, the phone rang. Unlisted number. She let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. This time, she answered. Ms. Mercer. The voice was clipped. Polite, governmental. This is Agent Tucker with the Department of Historical Preservation. We received a tip that you may have uncovered a military vehicle of historical significance. We'd like to come take a look. I didn't contact anyone, Gladys said slowly. No, ma'am, he said, but someone else did. She hung up. A minute later, Buddy barked from the porch. 2 black SUVs were coming up the dirt road. Gladys stood her ground as the agent stepped out. One flashed a badge too quickly for her to read. We won't take up much of your time, the man said smoothly. Just need to confirm what you found. I haven't agreed to anything, Gladys replied. This is private land. The second agent walked around her straight toward the Jeep. Buddy growled again, louder this time. Back off, she snapped. I said you're not cleared to be here. The first agent gave a thin smile. Ma'am, I assure you, this is just standard protocol. But her gut screamed no. They weren't here to preserve anything. They were here to take it, to erase it. After they left reluctantly, and only because she threatened to call the local sheriff, Gladys stood in the middle of her backyard, shaking. This wasn't just about a buried Jeep anymore. This was something people were still watching, still hiding, and she had only scratched the surface. She looked down at the journal in her hand, then back at the mound of earth beside the half-exposed vehicle. Whatever truth Henry Monroe had died to protect, she had just dug it up. And someone out there wanted it to stay buried. For 3 days after the agents left her property, Gladys didn't touch the Jeep. She couldn't, not because she was afraid of what else she might find, but because for the first time in years, she realized she wasn't alone. Not truly. Not in the spiritual sense. No, it was something colder, sharper. She could feel it in the way her phone clicked before it connected, in the strange humming sound on her landline, in the silence that followed her, even when Buddy was beside her wagging his tail like nothing was wrong. She began watching her own windows, like a stranger might be standing behind them. This wasn't just about history anymore. It was about surveillance, about secrets. And she was standing in the middle of both. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday night. She'd gone to town for groceries and caught a man sitting inside a gray sedan near the gas station, same model she'd seen on her road 2 days ago. He was parked under the glow of a flickering street lamp, pretending to read a newspaper in the dark. Old trick? Too old to fool a mechanic's daughter. She didn't say a word. She simply got in her truck, circled the block twice, then pulled into the fire station's parking lot and sat there for 10 minutes, engine off. But something inside her had shifted. She didn't feel scared anymore. She felt angry. That night. She climbed up to the attic again, flashlight in one hand and the trunk already open from before. She reached for the old cigar box in the corner, the one her grandfather kept tucked away, behind his winter coats that still smelled faintly of tobacco and oil. Inside the box were letters. Dozens of them, all from Henry Monroe. They spanned 20 years. Some typed, some handwritten, all cautious, all filled with phrases like burn after reading, and they can't know, and no one else can ever see this. But one letter stood out. It was dated August 17th, 1963, the same year Kennedy had visited Georgia. If anything ever happens to me, bury the car, burn the second journal. Keep only the one I left in the glove box. It's enough to tell the story, but not enough to ruin lives. You understand what we saw. Walt, you were there. You saw what they did. Gladys dropped the page. You were there, she whispered aloud. Grandpa, you didn't just protect him. You helped him. She couldn't breathe. She had grown up idolizing Walter Mercer, a man of principles, a war hero, the kind of stoic strength every small-town girl looked up to. But now she saw him through a new lens. Not as a distant man with a tired soul, but as someone carrying a weight too dangerous to speak aloud. He wasn't just hiding someone else's past. He had lived it, and had spent a lifetime trying to forget it. Gladys didn't sleep that night. Instead, she pulled the Jeep's tarp back over the windshield to shield it from the rain and walked the perimeter of her yard in boots and a raincoat. Buddy followed her without a sound, his nose twitching at every gust of wind. She thought of the man who had died in Europe, whose story now lived in her attic and under her garden. She thought of the government men who smiled too quickly and looked at her like a file to be closed. And she thought of her own place in this story. Why her? Why now? The answer came quietly, like a whisper inside her own mind. Because she dug, because she didn't look away, because someone finally had to. The next morning, she drove to the nearest library and asked for a public records request form. The clerk raised an eyebrow. Military history, he asked. No, she replied. Buried history. She spent 6 hours in front of a dusty microfilm machine, eyes burning as she searched for any mention of Operation Sentinel. Nothing, at least not directly. But she found something else, a report from 1947, about a missing army convoy carrying classified transport through rural France. The vehicle had vanished. 2 soldiers were reported AWOL, case closed, no resolution. The 2 names listed. Henry Monroe, Walter Mercer. She stared at the screen, stunned. Grandpa had gone AWOL and no one had ever known. That's why there were no medals in the hallway, no war stories over dinner. Just long silences, sudden outbursts, and always locked doors. He had come home, but he had never really left the battlefield. Gladys went home and stared at the Jeep. Half buried, half revealed, just like the truth itself. She didn't know what the full story was. Not yet. But she knew one thing. The secret wasn't hers to bury again. It had waited long enough in the dirt. The next morning, Gladys stood in front of the Jeep with her arms crossed, heart pounding. The sunlight glinted off the dusty chrome, and for the first time, the war relic didn't feel like a relic at all. It felt like a door she had a choice to walk through or walk away from. She could have let it go, could have called the police, handed it off to historians, maybe even buried it all again like her grandfather had. And who would have blamed her? She hadn't asked for any of this. But deep down, she knew if she walked away now, she'd spend the rest of her life haunted by the feeling that she'd almost uncovered something that mattered. Something that still mattered today. So instead of stepping away, she picked up the wrench. Gladys spent 2 full days working on the Jeep. It was the kind of restoration she hadn't done in years, a deep, meticulous, hands-in-the-grease kind of job that made her feel both exhausted and alive. The frame was in better condition than she'd expected. Someone, maybe her grandfather, had taken care to seal it before burying it. The engine was rusted, but salvageable. The battery, of course, was long dead, but the wiring looked original. It wasn't about making it run. It was about bringing it back to life. Each bolt she turned, each part she cleaned, felt like reaching backward through time, through secrecy, betrayal, and brotherhood. She wasn't just fixing a vehicle. She was uncovering a man's final truth. On the 3rd day, she received a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in courier font. "We strongly advise you to discontinue your excavation. What was hidden for a reason. Walk away." There was no signature. She stared at it for a long time, her breath shallow. Not from fear, but from something else. "Resolve!" She folded the letter neatly, placed it in the metal box with the others, and locked it. That was their mistake, whoever they were. They thought fear would stop her. They didn't know her blood. That night, as the sky turned pink above the Georgia hills, she called someone she hadn't spoken to in years, Tommy Rayner, a war historian who had once tried to date her back in high school. He now ran a modest but respected veterans museum in Savannah. "Tommy, it's Gladys Mercer." A pause. "Then, well, I thought you fell off the edge of the earth." "I dug up something I think you need to see." "You calling for a date after all these years?" "No," she said flatly. "I found a Yubiloi Army Jeep, buried, on my land, with documents, photos, a journal. Dead silence. Then I'll be there by morning." Tommy showed up at 6:12, ma'am. The next day, wearing the same beat-up leather jacket he'd worn at 17. He stood in front of the Jeep, whistled low, then took off his hat and ran a hand through his gray hair. "Gladys," he muttered. "Do you have any idea what this is?" He spent 2 hours going through the contents of the metal box, while she told him everything: the trench under the garden, the letters in the attic, the name Henry Monroe, the warning from the men in black SUVs. Tommy looked pale by the time she finished. "I've heard whispers about Operation Sentinel," he said. "But it was always just legend, some kind of black ops division that didn't officially exist. Rumor was they ran missions even after the war ended, covered up a lot of things, dirty things, things nobody wanted recorded." He tapped the journal. "This, if it's authentic, it could blow the lid off a part of history they've kept buried for 80 years. Gladys stared at him. "Then let's open it." The next few days became a blur of meetings, calls, and recordings. Tommy took high-res scans of every page of the journal and uploaded them to an encrypted server. They didn't want to involve the press, not yet, but they contacted a retired military archivist who agreed to fly in quietly. Then came a documentary filmmaker from Charleston who'd heard rumors from an anonymous tip. And through it all, Gladys remained at the center of it, not as a mechanic or a bystander, but as the keeper of a truth someone had risked everything to protect. She read the journal cover to cover every night before bed. Henry Monroe wasn't just a soldier. He was a witness. A whistleblower before that word even existed. And her grandfather, he wasn't just a protector. He had likely risked everything by helping Henry vanish, and had taken that secret to the grave. One evening, Gladys stood in the barn with the lights low, the Jeep sitting silently beside her. She reached out, placed her hand on the steering wheel, and whispered, "I see you now." The war was long over, but some stories were still fighting to be heard. And maybe, just maybe this time, someone was finally listening. Gladys wasn't used to people asking her for anything. For most of her life, folks passed her by with a nod or a polite wave. She kept to herself, worked with her hands, and found comfort in the solitude of routine. But now, she was fielding phone calls from journalists, historians, even a documentary crew in New York who wanted to fly her out for an interview. There were emails from veterans organizations, private researchers, and a polite but persistent inquiry from a government liaison offering to acquire and secure the contents of the Jeep for national interest. Gladys read that email, deleted it, and went back to polishing the dashboard. She wasn't ready to give this story away. Not yet. What changed wasn't just the discovery in her backyard, it was what it awoke inside her. For years, she'd lived in the shadow of loss. The death of her parents when she was 9. The silence of a grandfather who raised her with rules instead of affection. The quiet ache of never starting a family of her own. There were seasons in her life that passed without color, just time and work and sleep and repeat. But ever since unearthing that rusted army Jeep, something had cracked open inside her. Purpose. She felt like she was walking with ghosts now, but not in fear. She was carrying them forward. One morning, she stood by the edge of her garden, staring at the spot where she'd first struck metal. Buddy sat beside her, tail thumping softly in the dirt. She whispered, more to herself than the dog, "You think Grandpa knew it would come to this?" Buddy huffed like he was considering it. "I do," she added. "I think he left it for me. I think he wanted me to find it when I was ready." That thought made her chest tighten. She'd always thought of her grandfather as emotionally distant, maybe even cold. But maybe he hadn't been distant at all. Maybe he'd simply been carrying something too heavy to explain to a little girl with pigtails and scraped knees. Maybe this was his way of telling her who he really was. A week later, Gladys stood before a crowd of over 300 people in a small auditorium in Savannah. Tommy Rayner had organized the event A Night of Living History and insisted she speak. She nearly said no, nearly backed out at the last second. But when they called her name, and the lights dimmed just enough to blur the faces, she stepped up to the podium with the leather-bound journal in hand and her heart thudding in her chest. She didn't read a speech. She just told the story. How she found the Jeep, the man in the sunglasses, the letter, the whispers in the attic, her grandfather, Henry Monroe, and the things left behind that were never meant to stay buried. By the time she finished, the room was silent, not from disinterest but from reverence. Even the documentary crew had lowered their cameras. Gladys looked up, her voice steady. Some secrets rot in the ground, but others, they bloom when you give them light. I think this was one of those. Applause rose, slow and thunderous. For the first time in years, Gladys didn't shrink back. She stood tall. When she got home that night, there was a letter waiting for her. Handwritten. Inside was a photograph, yellowed with time, of 2 young soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder in front of an armored Jeep. One had H. Monroe scribbled in faded ink beneath it. The other? W. Mercer. On the back, a note. I knew your grandfather. He was a good man. He kept his promise when most would have folded. You did right by him. E.M. No address, no explanation. But the message was clear. She wasn't alone in remembering anymore. In the weeks that followed, Gladys worked with the local Veterans Museum to create a permanent exhibit. They named it the Sentinel Jeep. The vehicle remained on her land, but a replica and a digital archive were made available for the public, along with scanned pages from the journal, declassified documents, and audio interviews. School children came on field trips. Elderly vets wept quietly in front of the display. Gladys sat on a folding chair by the rear wheel and told the story again and again, not because she had to, but because each time she did, the weight on her chest grew lighter. One afternoon, a little girl no older than 8 approached her at the exhibit. She had freckles, wild curls, and a notebook clutched to her chest. Did you find it by accident? She asked. Gladys smiled. No, I think it found me. The girl beamed and scribbled that down. That night, back home. Gladys poured herself a cup of tea and sat on the porch with Buddy curled at her feet. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting long golden rays across the fields. She looked toward the shed, where the Jeep sat under canvas, and felt a warmth spread in her chest. Not from pride, from peace. For once, the silence in her life wasn't empty. It was full. It had been 4 months since Gladys first struck her shovel against the buried metal beneath the azalea bush. 4 months since her quiet life cracked open, and history came pouring out of the dirt like a voice long silenced. Some days it still didn't feel real. But every time she looked at that Jeep, rusted, proud, and resurrected, she was reminded that the past has a way of rising when it's needed most. They called her the woman who dug up a secret war. It made headlines. CNN, NPR, even the BBC. But fame was never what Gladys wanted. What she wanted, what she had come to understand through all the letters, all the late nights, all the whispers of her grandfather's legacy, was that every silence hides a story. And sometimes, it takes someone ordinary to give that story back its voice. The morning the exhibit officially opened at the Georgia Veterans History Museum, she stood in front of the ribbon with trembling hands. The mayor handed her the scissors, and the museum director whispered, "You ready?" She wasn't, but she nodded anyway. A crowd had gathered local veterans in uniform, school children in matching t-shirts, reporters with lenses as long as baseball bats. And in the front row, sitting beside Tommy Rayner, was Mrs. Ellison, a 92-year-old nurse who had served in France during World War II. She had come after seeing Henry Monroe's name in the news. I met him once. She'd told Gladys, briefly, kind eyes. Never forgot them. When the ribbon fell, a soft cheer rippled through the air, but Gladys barely heard it. She was staring through the glass at the journal. That worn leather book had traveled through war, betrayal, and decades of silence. And now it was seen. Later that evening, she returned to her home, now lovingly referred to by locals as the house that history forgot. She sat by the fire. Buddy curled up beside her and reread the last entry in Henry Monroe's journal one more time. She could recite it by heart now, but still it hit her chest like a prayer. One day, someone will dig this up. Someone who hasn't forgotten how to feel. If they do, maybe then the truth won't just be a burden. Maybe it'll be a gift. Gladys closed the book and let the tears come. She hadn't cried much during the whirlwind of attention. But here, alone with the crackle of the fire and the quiet rhythm of a life reclaimed, she let herself feel it all. The ache, the beauty, the strange and humbling gift of being chosen not by people, but by the past. In the days that followed, letters came from descendants of soldiers mentioned in the journal. Some shared their own fragments of stories, snippets of letters, old medals, names whispered in family gatherings but never explained. One woman from Oregon sent a photo of her great-uncle with Henry Monroe, dated 1945, smiling under the Paris sun. Gladys pinned that photo above her workbench. It reminded her that what she'd found wasn't just one man's truth. It was a web of lives, all tangled together by war and fear and love and duty, waiting decades for someone to listen. She kept the Jeep. Though it was offered a permanent place at the museum, Gladys politely declined. "It belongs here," she said, "on the land where it was buried, on the land that kept its secret and gave it back." She parked it under the tall oak behind her shed, planted new azaleas nearby, and built a small wooden bench beside it. Sometimes neighbors would stop by just to sit for a while, not to take photos, not to ask questions, just to be still, to remember, to feel. One chilly autumn evening, a young girl, the same one who'd once asked if the Jeep had found Gladys, returned with her father. The man approached shyly, hands in his pockets. "She's doing a school project on World War II, he explained. "Wants to know if she can ask you some questions." Gladys smiled and nodded toward the bench. As the girl opened her notebook, eyes wide with wonder, Gladys felt something stir deep inside her. Legacy. Not the kind written in textbooks, but the kind passed down in living rooms, porches, and gardens, in shared silence, in kept promises, in a buried Jeep that refused to be forgotten. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long golden shadows across the Georgia soil, Gladys looked out at her land, once quiet, now hallowed. Her story, like the Jeep, had been pulled from the earth, not for attention, not for glory, but for truth. And in a world full of noise, it was the quiet truths, the ones buried in gardens and whispered in journals, that often had the power to move us most. Not every hero wears a uniform. Some carry a shovel, a wrench, or the quiet burden of legacy. As the sun set behind the Georgia hills, Gladys Mercer didn't stand taller because she found a buried Jeep. She stood taller because she listened to the silence no one else had questioned. And in doing so, she gave voice to a man who had waited decades to be remembered. The mechanic who once fixed broken trucks in a dusty garage had become the keeper of a hidden truth, one that now belonged to every forgotten soldier, every overlooked story, and every ordinary person who dares to believe that history still has something to say. Because for Gladys and those like her, the past wasn't something to bury. It was something to honor, to share, and to rise from. She didn't just unearth a war secret, she unearthed a reason to keep digging. The end. Up next, 2 more stories that prove quiet courage still changes the world. Click to keep watching, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe truth is worth uncovering.